All right, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here. This is actually my first talk at TypeScript Michigan. I do talk at other places, not always about TypeScript, but I'm kind of excited to talk about this. This was spun from a couple, I work, actually, you know what, I'll talk about that on the next slide. So the title of this topic is how to add TypeScript to a pre-existing project. I'm sure everyone here either works with TypeScript or wants to work with TypeScript. The goal of this talk is to delve into the strategies and the best practices for implementing TypeScript into a pre-existing project. So just a little bit about me, I won't take too long. So my name is Vagish. I'm a software architect at Vitaku. I'm actually a Londoner, I guess formally. I guess I go back enough to London that I can use that term. But I also live in Toledo. So Toledo is a bit south of Ann Arbor. So I don't know if most of you have been there, but you've probably heard of it. I'm also a BGSU alumni. I'm also a serial startup founder. So I do a lot of startups, mostly between Ohio and the UK. Unfortunately, I haven't had the privilege of starting something up in Michigan, but that could be on the horizon one day. I'm also a strategy consultant. I have 3 kids. One who's actually about to go to college next year, which is kind of scary. My parents live in the UK, and my wife lives in Ohio. I travel a lot, So I'm going to go straight into this. So first I wanted to ask is, who's added TypeScript here? Maybe a show of hands, if anyone wants to talk about it, to a pre-existing project. Okay, so it's kind of 50-50. Maybe I'll ask, maybe later on as you go through, if you find better ways to do things, I'm more than happy to get some feedback. Okay, so I've always found it. So I've worked with TypeScript from the beginning and also adding it later. And one of the things I found is adding TypeScript later. Often we work with clients and they'll be like, oh, we don't want to spend the time or the money on adding TypeScript. They don't see the value, right? Because it's not a feature that comes out. I always try and say that there's a huge value because there is. Mostly for, I find it's better for error checking, and it means that you get cleaner code and it's less error prone. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So there's kind of 4 things that I found that make it trickier to add later. So one of the things is there's the manual setup. It's not like most people when they start a project, they just go, they do hyphen TypeScript or there's some starter and then you're just boom, you're done, right? It's all configured. There's a TSX file all up there and everyone's happy. Normally the ESLint stuff, there's a lot of boilerplate for all of that. So that's great. But when you don't have it, you might have to kind of add the boilerplate yourself. You have to go create that first TSX file, all those things. The second thing is kind of often you'll find, and this is actually a good thing, that you probably will have to refactor the code because you will find bugs when you're actually using types. And also, you have to kind of go through all the code and add the types and use them. The biggest challenge is the time consuming bit. Say you have a large code base, it's gonna, you have to really dedicate time and effort to go through and, review the whole code base, make sure all the types are there, make sure it's all functioning. And the last one is team knowledge. So, I'm sure everyone here is well versed in TypeScript, but I work with a lot of junior devs and it's often scary because they're like, it works in JavaScript, I actually work with a lot of people who use var still, and I don't like to use var, but that's a different conversation. So I kind of broke it up into 3 things. This might sound simple, but I like to break things down. So the first thing is, you have to set it up. The second piece is you got to add the types, and then, you're winning, you're profiting at the end where you're a fully typed app. We're going to go through each one by one. So when you set up TypeScript, there's some stuff like React and Next.js. Actually, it's pretty easy in React. I was looking at this and I was amazed. You just go in and I like Yarn, so that's why I put in Yarn, but you can use npm. It's npm install instead of yarn add. So if you do that and then you actually go in and you rename your file from JS to TSX, And there's a bit more than this, but this gives you enough to get started with TypeScript. You kind of restart the server, the errors will start showing, and you can go and start fixing them. There's a bit more, but this is just the simplest thing. If you do have something that does not have built-in support, for example, I use Apollo server a lot, which is GraphQL, and that doesn't have, if you use Nest.js in GraphQL, it actually has it built in, so you can kind of it's a bit cleaner. If not, you kind of have to go in and set it up yourself. I'm going to show you an example of how we've done it on Apollo server before. And if you find a better way to do it, let me know. So, forgive me for having the build source in there. I didn't want to have it, but it got in and then just never got out. So you can see, in the package JSON. By the way, this is an actual Google Cloud function with Apollo server in it. And so, you got this, you got the compilation, you got the deploys. When you're actually building it, so when you're doing the development, we've used concurrently, which allows you to run multiple things at the same time. Makes complete sense, concurrently. So we're doing TSX, which is transpiling it from the TS to the JS with the source map files. Then we're using nodemon to watch the build, and then we do npm run start. And if you actually go in, you can see in here, you can see it's got the dot, I was just going to look at this. So it's got the dot, it's got the type files, whichever. It's also got this thing that's map. The main reason the map's there is if you're trying to debug and you don't have that, it will just open it up in the JS file, which isn't very helpful. For example, the index.js. I mean, this is easy-ish to understand. But when you go into bigger files, it's just going to be really complex. And you go through it and you're like, well, what does this relate to my code, right? So when you're adding it in here, basically you have to go in, you have to add the packages. And so you go in, you'll add the packages, you got to set everything up. It takes a bit more tinkering. So by project, you have to set it up yourself. So that's kind of one of the challenges. It's not that difficult. It's fairly similar to setting it up for React or Next.js. It's just you have to kind of understand more of what's going on. And if you are new, I would definitely just start a new project and see how it works, then try and do it. Because there will be files that the new project that will have that this, when you're doing it, you're like, oh, wait, this would be really cool to use. All right, and then, so this is kind of the biggest bit that I kind of get involved in. Is so you've added the TypeScript, right? You're like, okay, great. And you're like, where do I start? What do I do? Most people, at least the first iterations that we did, we'd go in and be like, oh, well, whenever you add new code, you add in types, right? Then you end up having someone went and built this function, they created a type. Then there's a similar type. Then you have all these different things. And I think the better way to do it is actually, you really need to look at the whole code base, and you need to build out the types and then use them. That way, you're not going to have duplicate types, or it's a bit like dry, don't repeat yourself. The idea is go and find, is there a function that already does what you want, and then you kind of use that, and if it needs tweaking or whichever, that's a position of when you think. So if you do use a database, the thing I often like to do is I'll go and look at the database, and I do this with a lot of junior developers, and it's a lot easier if you're using a database that is SQL, because it has tables, and that's really easy because you'll be like, oh, this table is this type, right? And you'll be like, say there's let's look at posts and users, right? As a blog. So this post has a title, and it's maybe it has a title, it has some content, and then it has an association to a user. The user is a foreign key, and then the user has an ID and their name. In this case, you'd have a type that's the post name, which is a string, and then it'll be I guess a string content. It's probably more than that, but for simplicity. And then you have instead of an association, you would be like, oh, hey, this there's author is user, and then you go to the user and you have those types. But the nice thing about that is that you build out those types. That's a really simplistic thing. Most databases are a lot more complicated. It's a lot more. It gets a lot more complicated if you have many-to-many associations too, but that can be done in types too. The idea behind that is then you have like a set of types, then you add a process around it. So when the database is updated, the types are updated too. This is simplified a bit if you use an ORM system. I guess, does anyone know, is there anyone who doesn't know what an ORM system is? Like hands? Okay, so it's kind of like, so I come from the Ruby on Rails space. I don't actually know what ORM stands for, but basically the way it works is, you can have, you kind of build out a schema in code, right? And that's the nice thing is, the reason why it's easy is because you've got the schema in the code. So when the schema is updated, you can update the types. I don't know any ORM systems that actually create types themselves, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is one. So when you update the schema, you do migrations and you can do data. So it's basically like moving the database structure to the developer versus, in the database. That makes it easier. When you go into NoSQL, it gets a bit more tricky. But there are processes that we've implemented. So when we've used Firebase or MongoDB, what we found is you just make sure that when someone adds something new, that they have to update the types as well. And that way, it's like that makes it a bit simpler. It's just a lot of it comes down to process. If you got the process down and people follow the process, success. Then after we work with the databases, the way I like to do it is I'll go through functions. So normally utility functions, because there's not too many, right? And they're used a lot. Or something that's used. Different people use there's probably stuff in your config, utility functions. People probably everyone has different sections where they have those certain functions like DB actions or whatever. You go through those, add the types. If you need to create new types, that's an opportunity to create them. And then after that, you go through the pages. And this is the most time-consuming bit. It's going through, if you're doing a website, it's like a page. If it's a single-page application, it's still a page. And then if you're doing like React Native, it's screens. So you just go through them, you go through the components, and that's the most time-consuming thing. But hopefully, since you had done the database first, a lot of those types should be created. It gets, we can have a discussion about how granular types should be. There's there's different styles. This is how we do it. But if anyone has other ways, I'm happy to hear. Then after that, you're basically, this is the biggest thing. After this, you're basically, your types are all in there, your structure's all down, and then you have a cool type tab. It works, it's great. It's actually better quality code because while you reviewed it, you probably refactored it, and you probably found problems and things, and you've sort of solved them. And also the idea of, since we were trying to do a full review and creating types first, that also reflects into the code where you might have found duplicate code and things like that. And so what's next? After this, it's like there's some other tools I use, and this is my kind of thing. TypeScript, you make sure everything's fully typed, and then always that people aren't using any, and people aren't skipping on typing, because that's a common thing that I find is someone's like, oh, I'm just gonna ignore this ESLint thing that says, oh, I shouldn't do this, right? And you're like, well, but then you didn't learn. Why did it say that? If it's a rule that needs to be removed, we should have a team discussion. Is this rule supposed to be there, right? If not, let's go fix it. ESLint is a great thing. Most of the packages, when you do install it, when you use create a React app or create Next app or whichever ones, if you supply them with TypeScript, they will have the ESLint settings configured automatically for you for TypeScript, which is great. And then the last two I think are really important too, testing. I don't do full tests on test-driven development, but I do unit tests for critical things, like if you do transactions, like say you want to know a Stripe webhook is working. Like you don't want to find that out in production. You want to do tests, and you can use sandboxes, and you write those tests for critical things. And then this dovetails, I guess, into the final one, CI/CD. So you can take all those three and you can test them in your CI/CD pipeline too. You can do the ESLint, you can do testing. All of this is it's pretty cool. I love automation, so you'll see like my GitHub repos are always, they've got like 20 different ticks, or most of the time everyone doesn't get a tick, but it does help with better code quality as well. Any questions? And oh, by the way, you can connect with me if you want.
So I've only used TypeScript from scratch, not having gone through this, but I would imagine with some projects, they're so big that it's not possible to go and like write all the types up front. Does it make sense in some cases to have like the allow JS option enabled and like slowly migrate individual files over time? Have you had to do it that way?
Yeah, I mean, often we do set up allow.js, but the first thing you do is like once you set up TypeScript, you will we do the database first. So then we have something, and then people going forward, they're like, if they hit the database, they're like, oh, I'm going to use this type. And then yes, it takes time. If you don't commit, you end up having like a half-baked code base, which is worse than it's better to go one or the other. But yes, as bigger projects, some of these things, like with bigger projects, it might even take you a year or longer to actually get it all the way through there.
Yeah, I mean, in some large teams, it's so big and there's so many different people involved, it's just impossible to make a clean migration. So sometimes the easiest thing to do is just sneak it in the back door and slowly start, migrating things over time.
But you still need to get buy-in from the whole team.
Of course.
Like, the last bit I said, one of the 4 difficulties is knowledge. If the team doesn't understand how it works, someone's going to just like circumvent it. And like you're going to have someone sneak in where they just like disable. And obviously if you do allow.js, you also need to disable if you're stopping build because of a TypeScript error, you kind of have to let it fail silently, I guess.
Makes sense.
I don't mean to pick a bone, but like with the any and with like the incremental, I've found that allowing like putting TypeScript in the project, people like to use it because it's easier. So it's like by doing like the JS and then but also like the any too, any, you can just slap it on there and then you can get back to it, which makes it not that critical, especially if it's not a critical thing. So yeah.
There is a TS config setting, so you don't need to use any, so that it allows you to keep going. That's what we do.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I haven't done any really big projects, but I've done a bunch of command line utility things that I converted, and I found that telling it not to use implicit any, but allow explicit any work, because then I could, like he said, put the any in some cases when I didn't want to take the time right then. And then later on, you can go change that, and it'll immediately show you all the places that you need to go fix. So that worked for me pretty well.
Thanks. Just continuing in that vein, I'll give one other suggestion, and that's to use TS expect error comments. And I think there's a $sign at the front of that or whatever. And I've got mine set up that I have to also give it a description at the end of that to say why I'm disabling that or why I expect an error. And then that's also kind of nice because if, for instance, it was a case where TypeScript just couldn't figure out an inference or whatever, and I just say, I'm doing the right thing, I know what I'm doing, TypeScript is broken here or whatever. If you upgrade to a newer version, it'll see I'm not getting an error on this line anymore, and it'll actually move the error to your ignore statement, right? And so then you can go and take that back out and end up with the typing returned, right? So. Yeah, it's another suggestion if you're having trouble to use a TS expect error. Oh, I guess one other question I had is around dependencies. Did you have any problems adding the types into your dependencies, using definitely typed or having to add your own custom module definitions for your dependencies?
Yeah, I mean, some dependencies didn't have types, and when we tried to use them within a TSX file or TS file, we got errors. So then, yeah, we had to do that. Initially, we just kind of ignored them in our TS config, and then we went back and kind of set them up.
I suppose another approach you could take is if you have kind of clearly defined pieces of your app or features or whatever, you could probably even make module definitions for the other pieces of your app that aren't typed yet, right? So you can still sort of have that typing in say one piece that you're working on, and you could even sort of mock in the types from the other places without having to go through and put it in the entire place, right?
Definitely. Any further questions? Thank you.